Welcome, everyone. Many of you know me and maybe have done tours with me. Not everybody out there might be familiar with what I do. My name is Anne Robichaud. I am an authorized guide for the region of Umbria, guida autorizzata dell'Umbria, and I am the only American who ever succeeded in passing those horrific exams. I passed my exams in 1997. I've lived in the Umbrian countryside with my lovely, delightful Sicilian husband, Pino, since 1975. If you did not see my presentation, Umbrian Rural Life, you may enjoy seeing that one. That, along with my other talks, is on the virtual experiences page of my website. Due to the global situation, my way to share Umbria and Italy in general now is through these presentations. I would like to bring you virtually to Umbria, and we're going to do that right now. Italy has been called many, many times the land of the endless experiences. I think I can apply that terminology to our glorious region of Umbria, one of 20 regions of Italy, as well as to the little medieval town of Bevagna. This is a town of endless experiences. And we're going to have some of those experiences this evening and meet some of the people. We're going to meet Maestro Luigi Frappi, the painter, and you see him right here in the center picture. We're going to see a couple of the most beautiful Romanesque churches in Umbria. One is there on the left. We're going to see a frescoed theater, a tiny one where only 250 people can enjoy the presentations there. And it is one of the most lovely theaters in all of Italy, not just Umbria. We're going to learn about their festivals. As you can see in the lower left-hand corner, their Roman mosaics. So let us get started. We have much to share. An hour isn't enough. The purpose of this talk is to give you a taste of the wonderful town of Bevagna, called by the Romans, by the way, Mevagna. But there were people in this area long before the Romans. This town, like Assisi, like Spello, and some of you have heard my talks on those towns, was a land of the Italic peoples. No Etruscans here. Let us remember that the Etruscans settled west of the Tiber. We talked about two Etruscan hill towns, Perugia and Orvieto. But now we're talking about an Umbro medieval town. That is where an Italic tribe lived before it became Roman. It is a flourishing town for the Romans called Mevagna, also because it lies right on the Via Flaminia, built by the consul Caius Flaminius to connect Rome to the port cities on the Adriatic. The Via Flaminia went from Rome in 220 BC to the Adriatic to what is today roughly the city of Fano. And if you look at this photo of Bevagna, you can see the route of the Via Flaminia right through Bevagna. Some of you have been to Bevagna with me. We walked on the Via Flaminia. We didn't walk exactly on the stones because the level of the Roman city was much lower, but we're tracing the outline of the Via Flaminia. When I head to Bevagna, I prefer to head in this way with my car, following the walls, and I like to park in this tiny little parking lot right here. There are about 3 parking lots outside of Bevagna. They're all free. 1, 2, there's one over here. Not many tourists are visiting Bevagna. Mostly there's local people parked in these parking lots. That's why you have to get to Bevagna as soon as you can get to Bevagna. So I like to head this way. I'm tracing the route of the medieval walls. The medieval walls were built between the 13th and 15th century on blocks of stone, some of them dating from the Roman period. So when they restored the medieval walls not too long ago, they, of course, were working with stones that were from the Middle Ages, as well as Roman brickwork, local sandstone, and so forth. So we could talk about a medieval wall built on the foundations of the pre-existing Roman wall, a wall actually that may have existed as long ago as 300 BC. So after I come in this way and park my car right here, I head up some steps. Some of you have done this with me. And we come out to this lovely little bridge. This is my favorite way to enter Bevagna. This is a bridge over the Clitorno River. The Clitorno is a tributary of the Tiber. And this basin area is called the Accolta by the local bevanati. Accolta means the coming together of, accogliere, to gather together, accolta, something gathered together. What they mean really is the gathering together of the water of the Clitorno to create a wash basin area. But it's accolta for me in a different sense. It's the gathering together of the local people. Let me tell you that when I was here studying for my Umbrian guide exams on this bridge in 1976, I'm guessing, I had my little guidebook out, was looking down, and a gentleman came across the bridge, an elderly gentleman. And he said, "Ma lo sa che cos'è quello?" Do you know what that is? And I looked and I said, "Ma, non veramente acqua, I see water." And he says, "This is the accolta." He introduced himself, Dottor Silvano Piatti. I found out later he was a veterinarian, and a man with an extraordinary passion for his own town. And he told me, "This is where our mothers all washed the clothes when I was a child. And this is where we swam while our mothers washed the clothes. And they used soaps that they made at home." And he said, "By the time you were 9 years old, you jumped off the roof of the lavatoio, the wash house." And he said, "By the time you were 12, you jumped off the bridge." And I said, "What if you didn't?" And he said, "Well, then you were called a coniglio, a rabbit, the Italian term for you're a chicken." And he said, "Non volevo essere un coniglio." I didn't want to be a rabbit. So, of course, he dove in. Now, if you look to the other side of the bridge, you see lovely vegetable gardens of the bevanati. We're outside some of the wall here, right along the Clitorno River. They have a nice water source for growing their vegetables. And we're looking again at the accolta from the bridge, looking down. And the water power of the accolta was used when he was a child to turn the wheel of the mills that ground the olives into oil and the wheat into flour. Some of this water now, some of the force of this water is used for hydroelectric purposes to some extent for the city of Bevagna. And there is dear Silvano Piatti. You know, I tried to call him to let him know I'd be speaking about him tonight. He's now over 90. His wife has died. He has no children. I've heard from the locals that he's taken care of by a caregiver. The phone rang and rang, and I was not able to speak to him. And I wanted to tell him, once again, Professor Piatti, thank you for everything. And I'm going to share news with you about many people this evening. This is Professor Piatti, and this is one of my tour groups here. And this was probably 2008. This is some years ago. Whenever we would meet him on the street, he'd smile. He'd answer any questions. This is a man with a tremendous passion for his town. And this is Professor Piatti speaking to a group from Rome inside the theater. We'll be talking about the theater later. And I'd like to read what one of the women who organized this group wrote about him. She wrote, "Our participants were able to visit incomparably lovely historical and artistic sites with the precious accompaniment of Professore Silvano Piatti, a person of great culture and gifted with immense wisdom, who showed to us hidden details, stories, and legends giving to us gifts of uncommon warmth. The word in Italian is simpatia, and rare humanity. We thank him with all our hearts. And this is a note on the website of a lovely Bevagna hotel about Professor Piatti. The Bevagna hotel is called L'Orto degli Angeli, the Garden of Angels. And on their website, these words: all know something. One person knows all, and that's il professore. He puts himself at the disposal of visitors with the light gentility of a true gentleman, and he satiates like a top chef. He explains each stone and recounts their life. He takes his leave discreetly, declining with a smile any offer of reimbursement. For him, it would be to sell his beloved Bevagna, his passion. Passions are not sold, but to give away passion is a pleasure. And that's dear Professore Silvano Piatti. May he be with us for a long, long time. An extraordinary individual. And when I've done my Bevagna tour and I'm leaving the town, I'm walking over this bridge, looking down at the Acolta, the water, and who am I thinking of but dear old Professore Silvano Piatti. Now, after you come across this bridge and you enter Bevagna, if you're coming over the bridge, you're going to come up to the back of a church, one of the medieval Romanesque churches, one of the stunning Romanesque churches of Bevagna, San Sylvestro. This is the apse. We're at the back of the church. Notice the ferratoie, called embrasures in English. Very thin windows, not much of an aperture, because the Middle Ages is very violent. City-states fought each other. And in times of an attack by another warring city-state, the bevanati might even hide inside the churches. The church could be like a fortress. The church dates from the end of the 12th century. Next to it is City Hall, and City Hall is 13th century. On the church, we see the Romanesque influence, the rounded arches. A century later, we're seeing the Gothic influence. These are pointed arches on these windows up here. So we walk this way towards the apse of the church. Everybody with me? We're right behind, we're in Bevagna now, we truly are. We're right behind the apse of the church, and how I miss going to visit Bevagna, let me tell you. We're behind the apse of the church. Here's the embrasures. Notice the pink limestone used in the construction of the apse. The rest of the stone of this church is the poor sandstone of Bevagna, because Bevagna is in a plain, it's in a valley. I can't ever call it a hill town tour. It's not a hill town. It's in the valley, the largest valley in Umbria, the Valle Umbra Nord. And most of the buildings are of the very poor sandstone. But the apse of the church is the sacred place where the sacrifice of the Mass takes place. And for the apse, the building was done with precious, very firm and strong limestone quarried on Mount Subasio. And you remember Mount Subasio if you've attended my Spello lectures and my Assisi ones. It's that mountain 1,500 feet above sea level, backdropping Assisi and Spello. Pink stone, very rich in iron. Now imagine this, carting this stone in 1195 on carts driven by oxen, pulled by oxen, about 30 kilometers after it was quarried on the mountain to Bevagna. So therefore, not a lot of the limestone would have been brought to Bevagna, but that necessary for the apse of its churches. And now we're coming around this church. We've come from the back. And we're coming into the main piazza of Bevagna, Piazza Filippo Silvestri. Until 1949, this was called Piazza Umberto I, or Umberto I, named after one of the kings of Italy. Its name is changed in 1949 because that is the year of the death of an esteemed entomologist from Bevagna, Filippo Silvestri. Now, we don't want to confuse this word because Sylvestri here is the surname. Silvestro here is the name of the church, but the church is named after San Silvestro, built in the 12th century. Next to the church is the Palazzo dei Consoli, which is the city the civic building. Palazzo dei Consoli is taller than the church. You know, in the Middle Ages, they were always vying for predominance, the two powers holding authority in the area. The church and the comune, the cities, if you will, the city-state. In this town, this is much taller, isn't it? The Palazzo dei Consoli. It towers over the church. The church actually was never finished. It was probably going to be about 2 levels higher. You can see that they were intending to do a bell tower, and it was never, ever finished. Now, we want to get a closer look at this little gem of a church. And notice this is a walkway. So members of the city council could come in this way and have a private viewing of the mass from a balcony up here inside the church. And that way, if they were governing in a way that was not pleasant for the people, the locals couldn't get their hands on them. They could come into mass and go right out. Now we see this church of San Sylvester from the front. We don't have to talk about the fountain, everybody. It's far too new for Italy. It's late 19th century. It probably replaces a medieval fountain because on every piazza we have civic authority, spiritual authority, and water source. Think of the Piazza of Perugia. You know, think of the main square of Assisi. Isn't this typical of every single piazza of Italy? Now, here we have above the doorway beautiful windows. If they're bipartite, they're called bifore in Italian, tripartite, trifore. And to the right of the door is an inscription, and I have an enlargement of it here for you. And in Latin, the inscription tells us this. In the year of our Lord, 1195, Henry VI, reigning emperor, the prior Dio ti salvi and his brothers, and the Master Binello worked here. May they live in Christ. So be it. And this plaque honors, above all, Henry VI. Who was he? The son of Frederick Barbarossa, the father of Frederick II, who will be vying for power continually in the Middle Ages in this area. The locals say that it is because Henry VI was so concerned about wars and was involved in such bellicose activities all the time that Bevagna never had the peace and quiet and probably the funds to get their bell tower finished. So the Bevanati tell us that the head of Henry VI, there he is on the facade of the church in front of this church to look forever at the bell tower that he never finished. And this is a medieval codex, a medieval manuscript of Henry VI. But let's go back to the Church of San Silvestro. Here we have a detail of a beautiful trifore, and on the right, a beautiful bifore. Restoration was done on the facade in the 1950s. Let's see. And also up here, there's a cornice right here. You don't see it too terribly well, but the cornice underwent restoration as well. And I just want to show you a detail of the cornice. 2 animals here. There are an array of them along the top, sculpted on the facade here. And so there was restoration done on this church. There was restoration done. I believe they did a lot of restoration in the late 1980s. Now, this is the door, and the door has a lot of symbolism on it. This frieze over the door we're going to talk about. And this is typical of the Romanesque churches of Umbria. White limestone backed by pink limestone. Again, the limestone very precious, coming from Mount Subasio near Assisi and Spello, and used sparingly, but of course an important place is the door of the church. There's a lot of symbolism in this doorway. Here we have a mountain. The mountain represents Christ. The mountain here has a tree on it with coming out below the tree 4 brooks, and the brooks are representing the 4 Gospels. A vine grows up out of the mountain, representing the church. And hidden in the vine are animals, a variety of fanciful animals eating each other as well, and with the grapes representing the Christians. Now let's go inside. And here we're seeing the stunning interior of an exquisite Romanesque church. Everybody, I'd just like to mention something. Why don't you see Romanesque churches like this in Florence? Why don't you see them in Siena? Where are they? There was wealth in those areas. As money came in, the Romanesque gave way to Gothic restoration. More money came in, the time passed, Gothic gave way to Renaissance. Just think Rome, papal money, it's a Baroque city. Things restored. Umbria was a poor region. In the poor regions, which were part of the papal states, Umbria, Marches, and Abruzzo, you see stunning Romanesque architecture because money was not put into these towns to rebuild and restore. And aren't we lucky? The floor is a beautiful pink and white limestone. These columns date from the time of the building. Remember, this church was started in 1195. And if you look here, you can see a brick structure, a brick mass. It is built around the column because above this column was to be the bell tower. So the brick will give extra sustenance and support. Here's the holy water font. And typical of a Romanesque church is steps leading up to the presbytery where the altar is, because below the altar area is the crypt. You go down the crypt here. In the crypt, sometimes saints were buried if you were lucky enough to have saints, holy personages, also nobility. But the burying in churches is forbidden, I believe, with the Napoleonic laws. That is not any longer possible. And burying will take place outside of the cities with the growth of all the walled cemeteries. Here's some details of the columns. Again, sculpted in the 12th century. But we're going to see a column in this church, which is related to the Roman period, actually, also of Bevagna. These here, again, are 12th century, 13th century columns built to hold up the vault. This is a basilica plan, 3 naves, and very unusual is this fact. This is a barrel vault, but the side aisles, look at these. This is irregular barrel vault, extremely rare, to be seen in some churches in France and in just one other in Umbria, which is the church in Orvieto San Giovanale. Irregular barrel vaults are very, very unusual. Now we go up the steps here and we enter the presbytery area, the altar area. And look at the slit-like openings, the ferratoie, because crossbows could be shoot out, but arrows couldn't easily penetrate. And another Professor Piatti story. He told me that we had the earthquake of September 26, 1997. He was in this church right at the bottom of the steps with a director of the superintendent of art and architecture of Perugia. He has the keys to everywhere. And they were in to check the church because we'd had an earthquake in the morning. I think it was at 2:18 or something, just after 2 in the morning. And all over Umbria, they were checking everything. And then came the big one at 11:42. And Professor Piatti told me this column moved, another one moved, and he said, I ran a marathon for the door. This column split a bit. There was a fissure in it, a fissure, which you can still see if you go to Bevagna. The church was restored and retrofitted following the 97 earthquake. It did not come down, but those columns wobbled. Now, come down from the presbytery, go around the corner, go down the lighted stairway, and you enter into the crypt. This is the crypt area. It's holding up the altar. And this is a Roman column. Not unusual. Generally, we say where there's a church today, there was once a temple. And along the Via Flaminia, which went through Bevagna, of course, there were temples. So this is probably a column from a Roman temple recycled to use in the crypt. This is a medieval column, and you could see the difference, much more robust to hold up this vault. But this is recycling. This is called una colonna di recupero. We call it recuperation. when we recycle pre-existing structures. And here's a nice photo of the crypt. Now, along right, this area here, this wall here, that's Roman. So this is, the crypt level is the level of the Roman Via Flaminia. I'm not saying that this stone is the Via Flaminia. No, the stone was put down for the building of this church. But this is the Roman level of the city of Roman Bevagna. Now, we go out the door, and across the piazza is another stunning church, the Chiesa of San Michele Arcangelo, dedicated to Michael the Archangel. And we'll walk past one of the columns, which is standing right out in the piazza. It's a lonely, forlorn little column. One of those that was part of a temple. Its brother we just met in the crypt. And here is a nice view of San Michele Arcangelo, just on the other side of the fountain. And notice the rose window is missing. The rose window missing is due to restoration of this church in the Baroque period, and a lot of the medieval elements of this church were altered at that time. You could see here the rose window is absent, but this is quite delightful. This is an image done by Professor Frappi, Luigi Frappi, Maestro, we should call him, the great artist of Bevagna. We'll be meeting him, going to his studio. Some of you have met him. And this is his image of what that church probably looked like with the rose window. There's that Roman column. So we're looking at Michele's Arcangelo right now. San Sylvester is right behind us. We've just come out of San Sylvester, and we're looking at the other church across the square. Big festivities here at San Michele Arcangelo for June 6th, which is the feast of the patron saint of Bevagna, San Vincenzo, Saint Vincent. This is a 17th century, exquisitely beautiful Baroque statue in silver, carried on the backs of the gentlemen of the confraternity, the equivalent of the medieval guild. And I'd like you to note behind the exquisite doorway, again, typical of the Romanesque of Umbria, white limestone, pink limestone, another layer of white limestone, beautiful cosmatesque mosaic work. This is all inlaid mosaic. And we're going to be talking about the lovely sculptures right here. San Vincenzo was a martyr of the 4th century AD. He was the first bishop of Bevagna then. He is carrying the crozier of the bishop. And here's the crozier set into the church. You can see this crozier curving here. There's actually a crozier right here on the other side, because this church, San Michele Arcangelo, was the first cathedral of Bevagna. For reasons which I'm not sure of, it became demoted. In 1295, Frederick II decides it is no longer a cathedral. It just drops to the level of simple parish church. These pieces here, these pieces and this one with the crozier were sculpted without a doubt for the church. We think that these pieces here, the other ones, were all bits of architraves of the Roman temples which were nearby. Now we want to talk about the Incise Stone. Before we do, I just want to show you this little detail of the door. This is wooden 17th century restoration of the church, Michael the Archangel on the devil, sending him down to hell. But we want to concentrate on the beautiful sculptures to the left and to the right of the door. Michael the Archangel on the left thrusts his lance down the throat of the dragon, representing the devil. And there's an inscription. There's the top of the crozier. Can you see it here? And there's an inscription here which says in Latin, Rudolfo and Binello made these works. Christ always bless them. Saint Michael keep them. Here's Michael the Archangel on the sculpture to the right of the door. And he seems to be holding an unfurling, opening up piece of parchment. And he's very stern face. And this one says, help the poor and give joy to the saints as the Lord commands. Carry the book, it seems to say. The book could be this, the Bible. So these are absolutely stunning. Period, again, 12th century. Mentioning again, Binello, who was also one of the builders of the San Silvestro church. So Rudolfo and Binello seem to have teamed on both churches. Some of you have been with me to Spello, literally and figuratively. And in Spello, we visited the Santa Maria Maggiore church with the wonderful frescoes of Pinturicchio. The original church was probably built by the same two pair, these two fellows who teamed up creating some of this Romanesque architecture. Here's the interior. And it seems to be a lovely Romanesque interior, and it is now, but it is after restoration, extensive restoration in the 1950s and 1951, I'd say to 57, there was a lot of restoration on this church and also in the crypt. What had happened to this church? It was demoted, as we said, no longer cathedral, by Frederick II. In 1621, Pope Paul V elevated San Michele to the status of collegiata, which is not cathedral, but collegiata is a church with a group of canons presiding. The canons are appointed by the bishop. And at that time, a lot of restoration was done on the Romanesque church. And the Bishop of Spoleto presided on the inauguration, consecration of the restored church in 1666. More restoration went on in the 17th century, and they're just turning this into a Baroque wonder in the 17th century. So what happened? They abraded the column tops. Abraded meaning to scrape away the decorations so they could be stuccoed. So they turned this into a Baroque church in the 17th and then the 18th century. And then finally in the 1950s, they're going to bring it back to the medieval flavor. The bell tower on top was probably restored, its height increased with the restoration that went on in the church in the 17th century. And after we take a look at the interior, we can take the steps down to the crypt. And the crypt was beautifully restored to its glorious vaulted medieval simplicity between 1951 and 1957, when a lot of restoration went on. And let's say this, the church was de-baroqued. The Baroque is taken off and it returns to the medieval. Now, when we come out of the church, where do we go? We head right. At least we used to be able to. We can't now. I dedicated this talk to Professor Piatti, who's still with us at over 90, but this talk is also dedicated to dear Folo Trabalza, the tailor of Bevagna, who's no longer with us. The photo on the left is by Luca Moglia. Thank you, Luca, for letting me have this photo. And it is a scene that I'd often see when in Bevagna alone or with tour guests. Stools out front, the wind blowing, the braids, that would keep out the flies, and inside Professor, I call him Professor, Signor Trabalza would be sewing. Some days he would be out taking a break and chatting with other local gentlemen. Whenever I would go to Bevagna with my tour guests, we'd stop in to meet the last tailor of Bevagna, maybe the last of Umbria. It was a highlight of everybody's trips to Bevagna. And Signor Trabalza was thrilled to have visitors. He'd take a pause. He always would ask them, can you open these scissors that I use? And we could see two of my tour guests on the left. They took turns trying to open the scissors. Friend Janet on the right trying to open his scissors. And he was always beautifully dressed. On the left, it's summertime, a pristinely clean white iron shirt. In the winter, a suit that, of course, he made, a tie, an iron shirt. On the walls, he would always point out the portrait of his father. Next to the portrait of his father, this is cut off here, but it is a portrait of his father. The tailor shop is called Sartoria Moderna. the modern tailor shop, with little boys who were in the orphanage of Bevagna, and his father trained to be apprentices with him so that they learned a trade. And then always below his father, the Sacred Heart with a rosary hanging off. And to the right, there is a photo of Folo Trabalza when he worked as a young man. And he said this to me one time in a visit, and I wrote this in a blog note in 2013. He said, now and then I burned a suit in error. And in the summer, I had to tie a scarf around my head so the sweat would not pour down onto the suit I was ironing. And I closed that note with this memory. Signor Trabalza wears his tape measure draped around his neck as he points up to all the framed awards he has received for his artisanal work. And he would always be chatting with us. Here he is, pointing to his work. Look, he always had his tape measure around his neck. Here he's talking about his work and his passion for being a tailor and how he learned from his father. You can see here he's working on a suit. And I wrote in that blog note, don't ask Signor Trabalza who will carry on his trade. He knows he's the last tailor in Bevagna. And as he says, all suits are ready-made these days. And then I remember one time at a visit, we were leaving and it was wintertime. He was dressed and he had just shown us this beautiful suit that he was making. And he said, you know, I hope I will finish this suit. I hope he did too. I don't know exactly the year of his death. So I fondly remember Signor Trabalza in his tailor shop, Sartoria. When we'd leave, he'd be holding his tape measure. He'd raise his folded hands for that gesture of arrivederci when you cup your hands and pull people back to you. And he had tears in his eyes very often when we left. I don't know who has his beautiful sketchbook. I'm sure it's preserved by his son. This was always on the counter and he'd show us. These are all his drawings about his commissions with the sizes, the sketches, do this, do that. And so that's a Bevagna treasure. If his son, I'm sure his son has it, but Bevagna needs a Sartoria Trabalza little museum. This is a scene that I fondly remember. Now, here's the fellows sitting out and talking with Signor Trabalza. This is another place they'd sit on the steps leading up to the cathedral, up to the Palazzo dei Consoli, which is the city hall. And the person circled is Luigi Frappi, the artist who did the beautiful curtain inside the theater, and we'll be talking about him. And there's the steps. And to see these places in Bevagna, you need to go to the Pro Loco, which is a volunteer tourist office. The city can't afford a paid tourist office. And volunteers have the keys, and you book an appointment, and they'll take you up, open the door, and you walk into a gem of a theater, the Teatro Torti. This is City Hall. You'll notice that this part of the building is 13th century with the medieval windows in the limestone. This part of the building is newer. This was all added in the 19th century at the time of the restoration of the Palazzo dei Consoli. What happened? There was an earthquake in 1832. If you remember my Assisi talk, I believe we talked about it. It did damage to the Santa Maria degli Angeli Basilica down on the plain. It did not do damage to the Basilica of St. Francis that time, thank goodness. And when the earthquake hit in 1832, Palazzo dei Consoli caved in on itself. The bevanati, the people of Bevagna, decided that it was time that they had a theater. And this was mandated, the construction of a theater, and it was promoted by a promoting committee in 1871. And then work went on a theater inside, opening and dedicated this little gem in 1886. Isn't that something? And it's behind the doors of Bevagna. So many people, how sad I am sometimes when I do a tour with somebody in Assisi and I see them 3 days after and I said, what have you seen? Oh, well, the other day we just walked over to Bevagna. Well, did you see the theater? No. Did you see the mosaics? No. Did you see? Because these are behind the hidden doors. This talk could have been opening the hidden doors of Bevagna. But what a gem this is. This is frescoed by two artists. One is Domenico Bruschi, the other Mariano Piervittori worked on this building, done at the end of the 19th century. Now, this is a very, very small space. So the architect, some say it was a guy named Antonio Marini. A friend of mine who lives in Bevagna feels that very involved was Pier Marini, who was from Foligno and built Teatro La Scala in Milan. So we're not really sure of the architect, but brilliantly decided in this little theater that he did not want to design closed boxes that would give you a suffocating effect. So the boxes are open with these delightful railings. And not only that, but the design of the railings varies. This level are pointed, these are rounded, and then at the top he's creating other space. These seem to be little indentations, if you will, into the wall. They're not. This is called trompe-l'oeil from the French, trick of the eye. This is all flat, but it seems to be all arches up here. So it is really just an extraordinary little gem. This is the ceiling. And here you can see the trompe-l'oeil. Look at these. They seem to be niches, aren't they? And arches. No, it's all flat up here. And this is the dancing muses. And in these circles in black background, we have the masks, of course, a motif of theater. And then over the stage is the observatum fidem. This is the coat of arms of the city of Bevagna. In Latin, it means for having kept the faith, and it is said to be attributed to Bevagna in the 13th century by a pope at a time when many of the city-states were not supplying troops and support to the papal troops during their battles, and Bevagna did and was always faithful to the papal needs. So therefore, for having observed the faith becomes their coat of arms, OSF. And look at this. Doesn't that seem to be sculpture? Beautiful sculpture? No, this is trompe-l'oeil, trick of the eye, flat. This is all flat as well. So it is an absolute gem. This is a tour group with me, and when we were visiting the theater, and what I wanted to show you in this photo was the variety in the railings also. They call this bottom level Baroque-ish, this level Gothic, pointed arch, this level Romanesque. So even the railings, different designs to avoid a sense of monotony as you look up at the railings. Now, Professor Piatti, oh my God, the historian who taught me everything. He told me the most delightful stories of this theater. When he was a child, it wasn't much used for theatrical presentations. There wasn't a lot of money in the town. The people decided they want a theater. The people actually contributed and bought the boxes. And he told me maybe his family box was up here or whatever. And he said, this becomes the place of festivities, baptisms, weddings, confirmations, New Year's Eve. Look at these people in this old photo up in their box about to pop the bottle of spumante. And look at their box, you see, with the Gothic pointed arches on the railing. It was the place where all gathered for Carnevale, Mardi Gras times. You could see the children in their masks and the families up in their different boxes enjoying the festivities together of Carnevale. This photo is from 1928 of Terrato Torti. This photo is thanks to Luigi Frappi, the Maestro Frappi, the artist that we're going to be talking about as well. And Professor Piatti told me this. He said in Anna, when there wasn't a festive event like Carnevale on Saturday night, we'd all go there for ballroom dancing. And Professor Piatti is telling me this when he's like about 80 years old. And he said, and so, Anna, you had to be extremely careful because you would go out the door, up the back stairs to the box, maybe of the young lady who enticed you, and you would ask her to dance. her father would say, yes, you may take her to dance. You would take her down to the ground floor and dance with her. But then he told me with a twinkle, but Anna, if you took too long getting her back to that box, you never danced with her again. Professor Piatti, I mean, just a delight. Let me tell you the stories. And then in the 1970s, the theater needed restoration. The families didn't have the money to undertake the expensive restoration. At that time, the city of Bevagna takes over the theater. It's no longer property of individual families. It's property of the city of Bevagna, and they have an extraordinary theatrical season. I think restoration finished in the mid-'80s, started in the mid-'70s. This is the screen. The sipario was finished by Maestro Luigi Frappi. We'll be visiting his studio shortly. And this is a lovely scene. All of his landscapes are really from his imagination. Sipario, you would translate a theater curtain, but it's different in Italy than in the States with the curtains opening. This is really a screen that drops down the sipario. And in this photo, we can see Professor Frappi working on the sipario in 1992. And here, performing on the stage, Teatro Torti, is my husband, Pino. And actually, he's not performing. He came with me on a tour last year for Samantha and her friends a few years ago. I think it was a couple, Samantha, if you're watching. And they were just delightful. And Pino was lamenting back problems. So they got him on the stage to do some yoga moves with him. And the young volunteer who'd opened the door to us said, of course you can go up on the stage. And she was just delighted to see them perform. And here, do notice again the difference in the railings, Romanesque, Gothic, and the little Baroque railings. So this is the Teatro Torti, certainly to be visited when you head to Italy. You want to put Umbria on your list and a town like Bevagna. And if you're not going with the guide, and if I can't guide you and you're still going, let me know and I'll get you the number of the pro local and get somebody to open these doors for you so you can get in to see these gems. Inaugurated in 1886, the theater. And now, of course, electricity, but look at the electricity comes to you through these delightful lamps imitating the original gas lamps. And now we're going to walk from the Teatro Torti through some of the delightful medieval back streets of Bevagna. They're often buttressed to give support to the buildings, which can buckle out in seismic moments. And as we walk through the back streets, we're probably going to pass this little street coming out of the main square where a group of gentlemen always sit and they have chairs. And the chairs are labeled in Umbrian dialect, and only they are supposed to sit in those chairs. So this is a Di Angelino or Postino in dialect. This is Angelino's. He was the mailman. This is Trentino. He worked for the railway. And this chair belongs to my uncle. And there's two of the gentlemen next to their chairs. And I don't know where the third chair was the day that I took that photo here. And I want to thank Rick, who's been wonderful. Rick, you're right there. He's done some great things in helping me, like incorporating photos into one photo. So Rick put this together for me because I had the photos of the single chairs and wanted to include the gentlemen near their chairs. And we come around the corner from this street, and we are lucky enough to enter into the Palazzo, a beautiful palazzo of the 17th century, where an astounding artist, Luigi Frappi, once had his studio. I talked to him on the phone yesterday. I wanted to ask him if I could use these photos from his own blog. He said, of course you can use them. And I said, you're not in the palace anymore, are you? And he said, no, it needs restoration. I said, where are you, Maestro? And he said, well, I'm in the city of Foligno. And I said, what are you doing now in all this lockdown? He said, what am I doing? I'm painting all day. That's his passion. He started actually as a photographer as a young man. And he bought the legendary Canon Palix with his savings. And he believed, and I want to read this quote because this is from his blog written by a friend of his. He believed that an image obtained with a good camera was perfect in the sense that it contained and expressed without interventions all the possible meanings. Afterwards, he devoted himself to painting, with the spontaneity of a child in the wake of his father, an excellent painter, and the brush made on the canvas what a camera could never have done. And the same person who wrote this said, Frappi never paints his landscapes from life, but finds them in his imagination, yet they are real. He doesn't do plein air painting. These are all landscapes of his imagination. Some of you have been with me to his palace. Sandy is one, and I know she's listening today, maybe Jerry too. We went up the stairs into this room, which is a palace really, where his studio was. The room to the right was the former chapel of the palace where some of his paintings are displayed. And here's a delightful photo of Maestro. He's lovingly called Gigi by the locals, Luigi. This is his self-portrait. He's Rembrandt, a Rembrandt self-portrait. Here's another Frappi self-portrait. And you can see a couple of his landscapes and these extraordinary portraits of, you know, grapes and orange and the light flowing off them, the jar of red peppers. And I was there maybe last year, I think, with Angela and Derek, and Professor Piatti showed us one of his latest. This is a Caravaggio Revisited with a little touch of Andy Warhol. Isn't that something? I don't know if he sold that painting, but that is something. That would have been Caravaggio, Judith with the head of Oloferno, but the head is Andy Warhol. He is a delight. He's witty. He's artistic. A visit with him is a way to pass an afternoon, let me tell you. And here you can see some details of his extraordinary paintings. This one, the meat. Look at then how real that meat is looking. Well, that meat could have been the meat actually from the Norcineria of Marco and Rosita and their son Matteo, but I don't know. This is the Norcineria of Bevagna, and it is also a macelleria. So let us remember from my talk on Norcia, for those of you who weren't there, that Norcineria would be a place, a butcher specializing in pork meat, particularly, right? Macelleria, beef as well. They also have a restaurant where they serve fine slices of beef. And stop at this Norcineria was always an important stop on my Bevagna tours. And there's Rosita serving us some of the Norcineria goodness, prosciutto, capocollo, salami. They now have a restaurant. And one of their prime dishes is piccerilli. Piccerilli made with pork cheek, barbozza. And I don't know if they make the piccerilli or if they buy them from the shop, the piccerilli, excuse me, I was saying piccerilli, or if they buy them from Sylvia's shop. She and her mother have the fresh pasta shop in Bevagna, which her mother opened in the 1970s, Sylvia joining her later in the 80s. And the last time I was there, I think I was with Derek and Angela, I couldn't resist ravioli stuffed with pistachios and orange. There were ravioli stuffed with lemon. There were gnocchi made with the great Sagrantino wine. Quite a place. And not to miss if you get to Bevagna. And not too far from there, you can enter the door if you've called up and have someone open the door for you to enter into the frigidarium, the room of the cold water baths of the Roman theater of Bevagna, 2nd century AD. The beautiful mosaics on the floor, black and white tesserae. Black probably is the basalt, a volcanic rock. The white is probably local limestone. And the motifs are sea animals, sea creatures. And typical of the baths will be the Triton, which is really a, excuse me, a merman, if you will. It was a divinity really for the Greeks. And the hippocampo, which we also translate as seahorse. In mythology, the hippocampo has a tail like a fish, and its mane is really algae. And here you can see the triton, and here you see the hippocampo or the seahorse. And the lobster, this is probably a mythological eel of some sort. And I put this in to show you. This is in Bevagna. This is in Ostiantica, Rome, 2nd century AD. And look at how similar they are. The tail was always that of a fish on the hippocampo, or shall we say, mythological seahorse. And the mane was algae. And the tail was that of a fish, but also algae would be coming off the hoofs. Now, it is thought, maybe one of the guides at the museum told us one time that it is thought maybe that mosaicists worked all over the empire because many of the themes are so similar. These themes are also to be seen in the Roman mosaics of Herculaneum of Pompeii, for example. The sea creatures. Here are dolphins. And I put this in and I wanted to show you. This mosaic here was not on view to the Bevagna public until about 1871 because it was the floor of a stall and somebody lived in the house above and they had hay on the ground and their animals in that stall. And then in the early 20th century, it was bought by the Italian government and restoration will start. Well, when they did restoration, you can't replace what is missing. Can you see this missing in the dolphin? Missing pieces here, missing pieces here. When they restored, they were adamant. The regulation must be restore what is there, do not replace what is missing. When they restored, they found out there would have been 4 rooms. The frigidarium was the cold water room. And then from the frigidarium, you maybe go to the tepidarium, the warm water, and the caldarium, the hot water. After you come out of the baths, if you turn left at the end of the street, you'll see Roman columns. This was a temple. They were probably covered with plaster. Brick was often covered with colorful plaster. It later becomes a church. And this church, and you'd see the facade from the front, is called La Madonna della Neve. I found out in my research that there are 20 churches in Umbria dedicated to Our Lady of the Snow. And they always have the same origin. There was some miraculous snowfall in August. And in fact, that's the origin of the church of the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. It was during the reign of Pope Liberius in the 3rd century. There was a miraculous snowfall. And from there, the church was built, dedicated to the Virgin. So we're going to continue our walk through Bevagna. Now we're in a curvy street. We don't have to talk about this fresco. It's St. Francis, but it's very recent. Notice how this curves. Why are we seeing this curve? We're bordering the ambulacrum or the entryway of the Roman theater of 100 AD. We come out of the curve and we come into this little courtyard. There's a sign over the door inviting us in to the Roman theater, 1st century AD, and the Roman or the medieval house. As you enter, you see this drawing. This is the ambulacrum. You'd enter into the theater, then climb up to take your seats to look out over the cavea and the area of the performance. And for example, near the Roman theater were temples. This is probably the temple that we just saw outside the Roman baths, because this would have been the area of the baths. This temple was a huge one. It's on the site of the present-day Church of San Francesco in Bevagna. And here is a drawing of the Roman theater, ambulacra, the entryway, the baths, you see, the church, which was a temple, Santa Maria della Neve. The other church, which I haven't shown you, but it was up the street, San Francesco, was a Roman temple. And this was the route of the Via Flaminia. So right off the Roman road, the Via Flaminia. Roman Bevagna, medieval Bevagna. Houses built into the contours of the Roman buildings. Now we're inside the Roman theater of the 1st century AD, the ambulacrum. And we're going to go up into the medieval house, which was built into the Roman theater by a group of 6 people who formed together the Compagnia delle Arti. And one of those people is right here. We can see her here. This is Claudia. And I went in with Derek and Angela, and there weren't a lot of people that day. So she decided to dress them up in medieval dress as she explained to them the medieval house. One of the things she told us was limited use of glass, even in the house of a wealthy merchant. Sometimes at a papal banquet, one glass could be shared among 15 people. Glass was so costly, it was often depicted in the color of gold, for example. Salt on the table is the sign of wealth. What word do we get from salt? Sale, salary. Because salt had to be purchased from the papal states, papal salt flats. Remember the war in Perugia, the salt wars of 1540, because they were protesting the high tax on salt. How did they know what a medieval house looked like? They had to study medieval documents and medieval frescoes, including the frescoes in the Basilica of St. Francis. This is the death of the Knight of Celano. This dates from the end of the 13th century. Look at the table. Very limited use of glass. One knife, 2 spoons, no forks. Pietro Lorenzetti, early 14th century, Basilica of St. Francis, the Last Supper. Knives, limited use of glass, no forks. In the medieval house, 1 fork. And the fork would be used to thrust it into a roast or a fish that you then plop on the table. There were not knives at every place setting. And here's the medieval table. And we're inside the Roman Amphitheater, not amphitheater. 100 AD, the loom in the corner. It was a place of social aggregation, gathering around the loom, the various women discussing. The chairs were very high. Claudia told us it was because of the cold in the winter, mostly, but you also didn't want to see who was coming around the backside. And here is the lectern where the merchant, because this is a merchant's house, kept his accounts. And I looked at that, and knowing they studied frescoes, and I said, was that from the fresco in Assisi? And she smiled with a twinkle, and she said, it sure was. That lectern was copied from this. This is the Crypt scene of Gaite, which you learned about if you were able to attend my Christmas lecture in the Basilica of St. Francis, end of the 13th century, the first nativity scene. There's Francis with the Christ child, and there's the lectern. One time visiting the medieval house with guests, Filippo was there. He also is part of the Compagnia delle Arti, and he was talking to us about the medieval bed. And the candles, he told us, were at the top of the stairs, so you knew you were entering a house of wealth, because poor people would have had beeswax candles. And to have candles of, they would have had candles of pork fat. Beeswax meant a sign of wealth. So the candles were displayed right away as you entered the house, because you see the steps were down here. The bed, copied from this fresco in the Basilica of St. Francis, the dream of Innocent III. Small beds. You didn't sleep laying flat out. You sat sitting up because you couldn't breathe very well. In the medieval houses, they sealed the windows in the winter, dipping the curtains into wax, putting them on the windows. The fireplace was right near the bed, so breathing was extremely difficult. And everybody slept together in one bed. That is, the girls and so forth. The servants slept on the floor. The boy had a cradle, because the boy was the heir to the family, and you didn't want him to be crushed during the night. What's another sign of wealth before we leave the medieval house? The plethora of spices, which had to be bought, couldn't be grown in the local garden. And another wonderful aspect of the medieval house is if you go downstairs, they have reproductions of the beautiful medieval ceramics and glassware, which you're also able to purchase. Now, before we leave Bevagna, and it's time to leave, we have to mention the Gaite, their extraordinary festival, the last 10 days in June, the Mercato delle Gaite. Gaite is a word which comes from the Longobards. It means a section or quarter of the town. The Longobard word was Waiata, and there are 4 quarters or sections of Bevagna: San Giorgio, San Giovanni, San Pietro, and Santa Maria. And the last 10 days in June, they compete in this wonderful festival. It all derives from a simple festival selling roast suckling pig sandwiches, La Sagra della Porchetta, that was a festive day in Bevagna as of the 1970s. In 1983, this celebration of food goodness ripened into an exuberant celebration of Bevagna's medieval life. Il Mercato delle Gaite, the market of the Gaite, and it started with just a street market. Mercato delle Gaite, and there's the symbols of the four Gaite. So it started as a street market, and there's still, now is the street market. Competition is representation of the market, representation of a medieval banquet, and medieval crafts and tasks. And there will also be archery contest. Isn't this a delightful photo? And I put the name of the photographer, Giovanni Gallardini. Yes, this little girl at the market. This is one of the market scenes. And now with this brief video, I just like to give you a little bit of the feel of the Mercato delle Gaite of Bevagna. You'll hear medieval music. It's brief and short. Just look at the faces and try to feel the passion. Rick asked me, why this passion? And I said, Rick, we have to remember about Italy. There's no nationalistic sense of being Italian. This has been a nation only since 1860. This is a country of campanilismo. Campanile is your bell tower. Your loyalty is to your town. They speak with different accents in Bevagna than they do in Assisi. That's 30 kilometers away. The people in Assisi often don't go to the Mercato delle Gaite della Festa for festas, but the Mercato delle Gaite Festa is lived by the Bevagnati, the people from Bevagna. They don't come to our Calendimaggio, for example, because it's not theirs. Foods are different. Piccherilli, that's Bevagna. I have friends in Assisi who have never heard of piccherilli. They never have tasted them. It's a pasta made with potatoes, eggs, and nutmeg, but it's only from Bevagna. Why would you not make it in Assisi? No one would buy it. It's a foreign food. We only like our food. Okay, now let's have a taste of the Mercato delle Gaite. Now, let me see if I can get... The competition includes, and we're wrapping up right now, the market, gastronomy. They do a medieval banquet, and the foods are from the Middle Ages. So are there tomatoes? Are there potatoes? I have been to the dinners at the Gaite, and it is absolutely an extraordinary experience. So the food competition is part of it. And the different trades. This is the wool carder. This is the tanning. They're doing tanning. They learned how to do this. They researched this, extensive research. And I want to read something to you that was written by, this is a quote actually from a former mayor of the city of Bevagna, and who said this. Let's see. Okay. The mayor of Bevagna, yes. We've tried to understand the daily life of those people, their artisanal tasks that on market days fill tables with their creations. Our festival produces those trades, from the working of raw materials right to the finished products put on the counters for sale, showing every step of the passage. The Mercato delle Gaite has gathered us together, created new friendships, solidified relationships, taught us to play, dressing as popolani, that means the common people, as artisans, as consuls, as nobles. It has taught us to understand an epic. Now listen to this. It has taught us to take on Boccaccio, to read Dante, to study ancient texts, to listen to Gregorian chants, ancient musical compositions played on ancient instruments majestically by our youth. We have learned to create looms, forges, illuminated manuscripts. This is all a direct quote. We've learned to dye cloth, to mint coins, to mix spices, to make candles. We've learned to act, to dance, to forge bells. Please join me as soon as you can at the Mercato delle Gaite to be with the bevanati as they celebrate with such extraordinary passion one of the most astounding festivals in Europe. And this was written up in a recent magazine, not just Italy, but in Europe for its authenticity. And when you go, as I did with the Polyphron family, we can dress in medieval costume to sit down to one of the glorious banquets. Let us join together soon for a June event in Bevagna. Thank you for being with me this evening. And I hope that we can all come together for a series of extraordinary adventures in the glorious towns of Umbria, the medieval towns, many of them, like Bevagna, hiding many, many a hidden treasure. Grazie.